Yes, and the scientific community has been saying that adaptation has deserved the kind of attention that mitigation has got all along for a long time. The third assessment report of IPCC emphasized the need for adaptation, particularly in developing countries. And it's taken a while for governments to acknowledge the importance of adaptation. To some extent, there was concern that focusing on adaptation would to some extent distract from the need for mitigation and perhaps be the fatalist thought that we wouldn't have to do mitigation anymore. I think the Bali COP 2007, I think it was very important in putting adaptation and mitigation on an equal footing. There has been a lot of talk about adaptation. The Cancun adaptation framework that was agreed in Cancun is very strong if it were to be implemented fully. The problem, I think, in much of the negotiations on adaptation is that the focus is so much on the finance. Finance is important for adaptation, absolutely, but if you have the money, you still need to have a clear idea of what you're actually going to do with it. So the focus also needs to be on capacity building, on planning, and on technology transfer, just as much as those are emphasized in the mitigation talks.
It all comes back to that awful F word, finance.
Well, yes, and of course it's important, and there is frustration on the side of the developing countries that they're bearing the brunt of the impacts, and they would like to see, to some extent, being they would like to be compensated for that, even though the word compensation isn't being used. But the work program on loss and damage is very much framed along the idea that there are developing countries who suffer, that even after adaptation and mitigation there'll still be impacts that one will have to address, and they're irreversible. How will developing countries address those? Finance is absolutely essential, but it's not going to be enough without a clear plan, without the institutional capacity, without the knowledge, and without the technical know-how to actually address them.
And you touched on it. Is it too simplistic to say that focusing too much on adaptation will just encourage people who think that cutting our carbon emissions is a waste of time and we should just try and cope with whatever's going to come our way?
Well, I would say that's extremely naive to think that, because not only have the IPCC made it very clear that you cannot simply use adaptation to ignore your mitigation requirements. If you don't mitigate, then the impacts of climate change at some point will be such that you're hitting adaptation limits very hard. You need adaptation because mitigation isn't going to solve all your problems, but you also need mitigation because without mitigation you'll have a level of climate change that you simply won't be able to adapt to anymore. So it's not an either-or question, both are needed.
And you mentioned the IPCC as a lead author, and I'm sure someone who's fully committed or at least involved with the preparations for the next report. How would you assess the interaction between not necessarily just the IPCC but climate science and these talks?
Well, I think the climate science in general, particularly the physical science of climate change, has always been there to alert people, policymakers, of the need for action. The projections that have recently been published, for example, also by the World Bank, are always again a wake-up call, and it just makes you wonder how more wake-up calls do we need to understand that this is a serious issue. At the same time, science is also able to provide much more detailed guidance on how to adapt and how to mitigate, something that is increasingly being picked up by the IPCC. It's not the headline kind of 2 degree, 4 degree kind of science, but it's extremely relevant to turn the academic results into material that can be used by policymakers and practitioners.
Do you feel welcome here? Do you feel fellow scientists? You're a very sort of I'd say vocal and very scientist who's very keen to communicate with sort of all members of the sort of the climate community. But do you think scientists in general feel welcome and accepted at venues like this, which are very political and very dominated by sort of negotiators?
Well, I know scientists who'd rather not show up at events like these, and I think that's fine. If you want to focus on science and get your material out into peer-reviewed published literature and work on IPCC reports, I think that's that is the core of our scientific work. At the same time, I think it's also important to not only reach out with our findings and make sure that negotiators are aware of it, but also to learn from negotiators what their key issues are and make sure that we are able to address them in our research. That might not necessarily be the physical climate science, but the work that I'm involved in, for example, which is more the policy analysis of the negotiations and their implementation, the link with development. It's very important to also be aware of what is being discussed here at the negotiations and to address the questions that are being raised.
And a final one on the policy analysis. Give us your assessment of what these 2 weeks could hold in store for us. The word trust seems to be at the top of everyone's list in terms of the key thing that needs to be fixed in this first week.
Well, I think the trust was at an absolute low after Copenhagen, and both Cancun and Durban have done their bit to restore that, and I think that is a good basis to continue on. The key issue at the moment is what will happen with Kyoto. Is there going to be a second commitment period? Who are going to be part of it? And what are going to be the targets that will be set? It's important not only for Kyoto. I mean, the climate isn't going to be saved just by a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. At the same time, the carbon market might be reliant very much on the continuation of Kyoto, the CDM, another flexible mechanism, the Adaptation Fund. They're all part of the Kyoto package. So it is indeed important to get a positive outcome from those Kyoto negotiations. At the same time, as far as Cancun and Durban, that process is concerned, this is one step towards 2015, and I don't expect any firework related to the global agreement that we hope to achieve in 2015.